This is from opposition media Thai Enquirer. The protesters are standing in silence to shed light on Wanchalearm's disappearance a year ago. He was an outspoken critic of the military regime of Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha. This is in Bangkok, Thailand, a city of somewhere between 12 and 14 million people, the city and surrounding areas. That's how many people could potentially show up for a protest, and this is all that showed up for this protest. There were almost certainly more journalists there than actual protesters. And who is this Wanchalearm, and what's going on in Thailand? Why are we still seeing these protests? Well, the US government has been backing this opposition for well over a year now. They have tried to gain traction with these protests. They have tried to recreate what happened in Hong Kong or in Ukraine in 2013 and 2014, or all throughout the Arab Spring from 2011 onward, and they have been very unsuccessful, as you can see. Wanchalearm was a very obscure activist who was mainly on Facebook. He had already fled Thailand. He was hiding out in Cambodia, and one day he just disappeared. And it was only until he disappeared that people actually started hearing this name, Wanchalearm. And it was because the opposition, from the day he disappeared to today, these protests, they have exploited his disappearance to try to energize their movement. And obviously it hasn't worked. And just so you can see what I'm talking about here, this is from the German embassy in Bangkok. This is a highly politically motivated and very diplomatically inappropriate tweet to make. They're talking about, imagine that someone you love suddenly disappeared, and they're talking about enforced disappearances. They're implying that the Thai government was behind Wanchalearm's disappearance. And yet there is absolutely no evidence, not even a single shred of evidence of what happened to Wanchalearm. Whether he's dead or alive, nobody was even found. And so here's the German embassy getting involved in Thailand's internal political affairs. This is the same embassy representing the German government complicit in war crimes with the US in places like Afghanistan and Syria. You want to talk about imagining something. Imagine being Germany doing that and then trying to lecture Thailand about human rights over a disappearance that there's no evidence of one way or the other what happened to him. Imagine that. And then I want to show you this BBC article because there's an important connection that I think a lot of people are missing. This is actually from 2020, so this is almost a year ago. Wanchalearm, the Thai satirist, abducted in broad daylight. And they talk about how he was in Cambodia, he disappeared, no one knows what happened to him. They're trying to imply that it's the Thai government, but there's no evidence of that. Then they give a little background about this US-backed client regime of Thaksin Shinawatra, this extremely corrupt billionaire. He has the worst human rights record in Thailand's history. His sister, Yingluck Shinawatra, was in power shortly after he was ousted by a military coup. Then she was ousted by a military coup. Incredibly corrupt. They're both hiding abroad as fugitives, and they are backing. They're still de facto running the opposition political parties here in Thailand, and they are backing these protests alongside the US, who wants them back in power. But what I really want to show you is the BBC citing people like Jakrapop, who says that he thinks the government was trying to scare people by killing Wanchalearm. But he's saying that's the wrong interpretation. I believe their decision to kidnap and murder him and others before him has been subconsciously radicalizing the people. No, it's not subconscious at all. It's because people like him and other opposition leaders leading these protests keep telling the protesters that the government killed Wanchalearm and that they should be angry about that. And they're doing it specifically to radicalize the protests, to make it seem like the government is a deadly threat. You could see how ridiculous it was. They claimed his last words were, "I can't breathe." So they were trying to tap into the George Floyd phenomenon in the United States. So you could see how artificial this was from the very beginning, how they were exploiting his supposed disappearance for political reasons. And then they cite this man named Somyo, who they're claiming is a prominent activist. Well, actually, he was a propagandist for Thaksin Shinawatra. He was the chief editor of Voice of Thaksin magazine during the 2010 violence, when Thaksin put these red shirt protesters in the streets and then sent in heavily armed militants to kill not just the soldiers and police trying to manage the protests, but also killed the protesters themselves. And I'm going to show you that right now, an example of what they did. And then I'm going to show you that they at least have the capacity to have kidnapped and killed Wanchalearm themselves, specifically to try to radicalize the protests and energize them and to get people out into the streets. So there's this video. I'm going to show you some stills from it. The video itself is very hard to find. It gets taken down from YouTube because it's extremely graphic. I have some stills. I've censored out the worst parts. But as you can see, there is a camera fixated on these two men. One has a very conspicuous flag, another is just kind of standing next to him. And in the video, you can see very clearly that this second man, who I call the spotter, is giving this man with the flag directions on where to stand and in which direction to face. And one other thing to note, when a sniper is trying to hit a difficult target, it's very useful for them to try to get cues what direction the wind is blowing and how fast it's blowing. And the dream scenario of a sniper trying to kill another human being would be for that human being to hold a flag indicating both wind direction and speed. So you can see he's facing in this direction. You can see a lot of people are running back and forth, and most people are up against the wall because there are bullets whizzing around. The spotter tells him to move over. And so you can see him walking in this direction. And then in the next couple of frames, you can see he tells him to look back in this direction. So he's very deliberately putting this man in a very specific place. And then a bullet takes the top of his head off. He falls to the ground. His brain spills out onto the pavement. And you can see everyone running except for the spotter. He's standing right there. He couldn't be any calmer. And he's waving his hand. He's waving his hand for someone to come in. And not medics, but no, it was a camera crew, and this is the camera crew. This guy right here, and in the video it's very clear that it's a camera crew, and they filmed this shot, and they got the stills. It was the stills that they were looking for. And the very next day, they have this come out on the front cover of Voice of Thaksin magazine, the magazine Somyot was the chief editor of. And take careful note here at the bottom, they say in Thai that here is a free CD. It'll tell you the truth about April 10th. And it was that footage with that cameraman suspiciously fixated on those two men right before the flagman was killed. They duped this man into holding this flag, getting into position. They deliberately killed him, and then they used the images of his death to try to radicalize the protest, to take it from a mere protest into an armed conflict. And actually from this day, April 10th, 2010 onward, until well into May, these protesters the militants were fighting with the army and police, and almost 100 people died in the process. There was mass arson that destroyed sections of Bangkok and also destroyed city halls in the provinces. So it got very serious. It was kind of a dry run for the Arab Spring that would follow the next year, also US engineered, and using very similar tactics. And so my point here is that this is what Somyot and the red shirt leadership did to their own protesters to radicalize their movement. It demonstrates that they have the capacity to have done this to Wanchalearm. Then there's this article in Prachatai just this week. It's a joint so-called investigation by New Narrative, Prachatai, and VOD, and they're all funded by the US government and or Open Society. And they talk about Wanchalearm, how he was this supporter of Thaksin Shinawatra, who I've already pointed out has the worst human rights record in Thai history. He fled to Cambodia. He was staying at this Mekong Gardens condominium. And the article here admits that while he was in Cambodia, his rent was being paid by other people. He wasn't paying for his own rent there. They say a sympathetic Cambodian official put him up for free in Mekong Gardens. Several other dissidents lived there in self-imposed exile at the time. So he was being surrounded by the opposition by their network. And so we're supposed to believe that Wanchalearm just suddenly disappeared right out from under the rest of the opposition's nose, that it really wasn't a case of him being worth more to the opposition as a well-known martyr than this obscure, aging opposition figure who no one really knew even existed. And because he was in Cambodia, his relevance was fading. We see the opposition, we see the German government, we see them trying to push this narrative that the Thai government did this to Wanchalearm, except there's no evidence. And the only thing that we can ask is who benefited from it. Did the Thai government, the military, or monarchy benefit from an obscure Facebook activist being turned into a well-known martyr, or did the opposition? And we see the opposition clearly has the capacity to do this because they've done it in the past. So I'm just going to leave it there. We should wait for evidence before we say anything. But because the opposition is speculating and deliberately causing political damage, I think it's only fair to explore other possibilities. The possibility the opposition kidnapped and or killed Wanchalearm themselves, specifically to try to radicalize and escalate an otherwise unpopular, poorly attended protest. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share it. Think about subscribing. It helps the channel grow and it's free to do. Check the video description for the links to the stories that I was covering in the video, as well as for ways you can help support my work, like by becoming a Patreon member. This allows you to pick a level that you can support me month to month, and sometimes I give some extra content to my followers, and it also allows us to have discussions, exchange ideas, and kind of build a community around this work. And to everyone who has been helping me, thank you very much. I couldn't do this without that support, and as always, thank you for watching.